Hi, this is Barb Fox from Cleveland, Ohio, and the book that I read is called Strategic Planning for Nonprofit Organizations by Michael Allison and Jude Kay. I do have slides, just 8 of them to go along, so if you want to follow along, please do. We only have about 10 minutes for this, so I divided the presentation here into 3 sections. First of all, just giving you an overview of the book. Then secondly, doing some very brief chapter summaries. And then thirdly, at the end, doing my critical analysis. So before I launch into the overview of the book, I wanted to share with you a definition of strategic planning that the authors provided, which I thought was great, on page 1. They say that strategic planning is a systematic process, what's a process, through which an organization agrees on and builds key stakeholder commitment to priorities that are essential to its mission and responsive to the organizational environment. Strategic planning guides the acquisition and allocation of resources to achieve these priorities. They also go on to say what strategic planning is not, and I thought this was equally helpful. On page 4 and 5, they say that strategic planning does not predict the future. Strategic planning is not a substitute for ongoing judgment of good leadership. The leader just cannot go on autopilot. Thirdly, the strategic planning process is not a math problem. There is no right answer. And then lastly, although the strategic planning process is very structured and systematic, as you're going through it, you're not going to feel like it's linear. You're going to feel like sometimes it's 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, or you might feel like you're on a roller coaster. They explain that if you're feeling that way, that you're probably doing it correctly, so not to be worried about that. Okay, so the overview. I'm going to do there's 3 sections that the authors divided the book into. The first section, they called it Preparing to Plan. The second section, they talked about doing the actual strategic analysis. And then the last section talked about putting the strategic plan into action, because you can spend a lot of time and a lot of resources on developing your strategic plan. You don't want it to just then sit on a shelf and gather dust. You want to use it. So those were the 3 sections that the authors divided the book into. Okay, now we're on to the chapter summaries. Chapter 1 talked about setting yourself up for success. They talked about the fact that the process needs to be a team effort. You can't have a sole executive director, or you can't have one board member initiate and do this whole process on their own. That cannot happen. Ideally, it needs to be 6 to 8 people, and you need to have staff on the committee, board members, and maybe even a client on the strategic planning committee, which I thought was interesting. The success of the process lies in building a very broad-based commitment. So you want to make sure you get all different levels from the organization. They also suggested to consider adding outsiders from somebody outside your organization to the strategic planning committee to provide an outside or objective point of view. They also discussed that the strategic planning process should be tied to the annual planning and the budget process, which you're going to see is going to come around on our last chapter as well as a very key suggestion. Okay, chapter 2 was about stakeholder engagement. You really need to engage all your internal stakeholders. You want input from people at all levels, both high and low. And input is not the same as decision making. So you need to listen to input from everyone, but you don't have to act on it. You want to be very clear that during this part of the process, in the planning process, you're seeking input, but you're not coming to any specific course of action at this time. And there was a wonderful quote on page 59. It says, "The chance of someone supporting the end product are enormously greater if they've had a chance to participate meaningfully in the process." And I've seen that hold true in real life. So I thought that was just really drove the point home. In this chapter, they also talked about the SWOT analysis, which we are all very familiar with from our text. They talked about getting groups of people together to provide their input using the tool of a SWOT analysis. So, for instance, maybe having 4 people from 4 different programs come together and do a SWOT analysis on the whole organization. Or have 4 people in the same program do a SWOT analysis on their program. So that's another way to get engagement from different stakeholders and to get input. Okay, the third chapter was on mission, vision, and values. Our text did such a good job with this. This book did not add significant additional information, so I'm just going to breeze over that. So now, if you turn, we're on slide number 5, and now we're into the meat of the strategic planning analysis. So now we're into the meat of it. The first chapter talked about doing an environmental scan. You need to know the lay of the land in your industry or in your market. The purpose of an environmental scan is to make sure your strategic plan is grounded in the realities of the world around you. And early on in one of Prof. Grill's classes, some of us, I think, watched a video about an Italian agriculture nonprofit gentleman who went into a very rural African area that was fishing based, and he thought he was doing such wonderful work by providing them with education on how to start growing crops, to doing agriculture. This gentleman did not do his environmental scan. So he trained, he thought he was doing such great work, he trained the people in how to plow the fields, how to plant the crops, how to tend to the crops. Then the day before they were going to harvest these beautiful looking tomatoes and beautiful looking eggplant, they let the people know, okay, tomorrow we will go out to harvest. So they get up on harvest morning, walk up towards the fields, and the day before there were beautiful tomatoes and beautiful eggplants, now gone, totally gone. And the people from Africa, the natives, said, well, yeah, of course, the hippos. The Italian gentleman hadn't done his research, didn't understand that hippos come out every night and would eat the crops. That's why they were not a farming-based community. So I thought that example came back to me when they talked about doing a strategic analysis here. Excuse me. The next chapter was on theory of change. This is really the heart of your strategic plan. It's kind of why you do what you do. And there's a few steps within this. Excuse me. First of all, is your needs assessment. That was very similar to, if you remember, our grant writing class where we had to come up with like a needs statement. Very similar. So it's really a statistic that you have found that maybe talks about the prevalence of the problem that you are trying to solve. So the prevalence of homelessness in your city, or the prevalence of autism in your community. So that's what that was. So you do your needs assessment. You also then want to ask yourself about your program effectiveness. How well are your programs responding to the needs that you just mentioned in the needs assessment? Then step 3, you are taking a look at your competition and really assessing how well are you doing compared to your competition. Now, your competition might not be a straight up obvious competitor, but it might be another organization that serves your same population. It might be an organization that overlaps with yours a little bit. So that's what you're doing in this section. Also, remember the Macmillan Competitive Strategies Matrix in our textbook? Doing that is also a way you can do your competitive analysis here. Then step 4 of this chapter talked about the theory of change, and this is where you get very specific. You're talking about exactly what impact you're going to hold your organization accountable to, how you're going to achieve that desired impact. So it's a lot of if-then statements. So if we provide proper respite to caregivers, then we will reduce the stress on the caregiver and the household. That would be one. Or if we increase the reading success rate of third graders in our city, then we will increase the high school graduation rate. So it's a lot of if-then statements is what you're saying on your theory of change. Then the fifth section here is to draft a future program portfolio. So if money were no object, what future programs would you like to institute? And that was that chapter. The sixth chapter was business model, and I really didn't know what business model meant. It's basically, how is your organization supported financially? How is your organization funded as a whole? How are you going to fund your current programs and also your future programs? So that was an interesting chapter. Then chapter 7 dealt with organizational capacity. And then later I watched that Dan Pilato video, and the points were so similar. There was a quote in this book that could have come from Pilato. It said on page 166, discounting the value of and consequently underinvesting in organizational capacity characterizes the nonprofit sector. So I thought that was very interesting, and it totally was congruent with what Pilato was saying in his video. There are 7 areas you want to look at when you're looking at your organizational capacity. You want to look at your HR, your culture and structure, your financial management, your resource and business development, your external communications, your IT, and then your facilities and equipment. And the last chapter in this section was on leadership. And a good quote from this chapter said that a brilliant, well-funded strategy, so you could have a great strategic plan, so a brilliant, well-funded strategy with adequate resources cannot be successfully executed without shared clear vision and direction, something that needs to come from leadership. So leadership is important, and a lot of the points in this chapter reminded me of what we talked about in the Collins book, Good to Great. Okay, now we're on the last section of the book. This would be slide number 6. There was a chapter, this is the chapter called Setting Your Course, or the section called Setting Your Course, where everything comes together. The chapter 9 is about completing your strategic plan. How do you build alignment and commitment around this new plan? And one of the clear critical things is that you have to have everything summarized very clearly and very compellingly in a document. That's what you're going to be working off of. And then chapter 10 talked about implementation, how to take proactive steps to prepare the way and ensure that people know how to put these ideas into action. And one of the best practical suggestions they gave was to translate your strategic plan right away. Translate it into your first year annual operating plans and your first year budget. And a good quote was said that the full value of the planning effort will only be realized through its implementation. So the idea is, once you have the plan right away, use that to craft the first year budget and your first year operating plans. So that was the chapter by chapter summary. My critical analysis, it was a very good book, very detailed. There were times you could kind of get lost in the trees and forgot that you were in a forest. But overall, great examples, gave very good case studies. They had wonderful forms to use that I know I'll go back and use later. Forms to use and questions to ask as you go through the process. They had a very good section for facilitators who are facilitating this process. They would talk about, caution when you get to this section. Opinions can really get diverse and people can get very passionate. So don't be surprised if there are heated discussions. So that was very good. What I did not like is that I felt like I was reading a cookbook, but months before I would be able to cook. Or I felt like I was reading a book on how to build a potato cannon, but it was months before I would actually be able to build the cannon. So that was a little bit disconcerting to me, but I know I'm going to keep this book, and I will certainly use it as a reference tool. I'll be referring back to it again for certain. So thank you very much. Take care, and I look forward to hearing about your books. Take care.